The Battle of Manila was a brutal month-long conflict between the American and Japanese forces, with the mission to free the citizens and prisoners from the capital city of the Philippines. It was the first and only time that these nations would battle within the confines of an actual city, and would become a horrifically unpleasant surprise, not only for the troops involved due to the spontaneous and unpredictable methods of fighting, but for the large civilian population that it was home to. The unique urban landscape provided several vantage points, areas to hide, and favorable conditions to launch effective assaults. This was definitely something that the Americans were not used to when encountering their enemy, at least not for those with combat experience in the Pacific. In February of 1945, the city would become a death trap for the two opposing armies as they engaged in a ferocious fight for survival in a dangerously new environment. Before War in the Pacific even started, the US already had several major bases and a strong military presence in the Philippines and worked alongside its people to prepare the country to become an independent nation, improving things like education systems and infrastructure in major areas. General Douglas MacArthur would reside in Manila by 1935 and was in charge of the country's national defense forces, becoming chief military advisor for the Philippine government to protect them from any outside invaders. In the late 1930s, the US military presence in the Philippines increased dramatically due to Japanese aggression and expansion into parts of China, Mongolia, and Korea in search of iron, coal, and oil, which were much needed resources to keep their industrial economy and war machine moving forward. It was only a matter of time before they would need to head south as these resources were quickly used up, with American and Filipino troops beginning to process the unsettling reality that one day soon, they would be invaded next. And that day came. On December 8th, 1941, immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched a precise and calculated invasion of the Philippines, beginning with devastating air raids on Clark Field, the main base for the US Far East Air Force. Almost all planes in the base were stationary, unmanned, and lined up perfectly beside the runway, making them sitting ducks for the Japanese to destroy. This gave them total air superiority throughout the rest of the attack, sealing the fate of many Americans still on the ground. Japanese amphibious landings would occur just days later from shores north of Manila, but there would be little to no fight in the city itself, at least, not for now. MacArthur was ordered to flee with his troops to declare Manila an open city for the Japanese, to spare the civilian population from being caught in the crossfire, and to protect its rare landmarks from getting destroyed in the heat of battle. He would make his way south with several Americans that were lucky enough to escape, eventually landing in Australia where he would set up his headquarters, but vowed to make a courageous return in the future to take back the city. Unfortunately, there were still thousands of US and Filipino troops left in the areas around Manila by the time the Japanese had taken control of it, and these troops would flee to the Bataan Peninsula, an area east of Manila, surrounded and cut off from any escape route. These troops would hold out for over 3 months but would eventually lose the fight to the Japanese due to lack of supplies and ammunition, as well as the overwhelming constant attacks, being forced to surrender in early April of 1942. This would mark the start of the infamous Bataan Death March, where 75,000 US and Filipino soldiers, already suffering with fatigue from 3 months of battle, would be forced to walk 65 miles to a POW camp. Severely deprived of food and water, these soldiers who collapsed from exhaustion were routinely beat, shot, or bayoneted by the Japanese. It would go down in history as one of the most well known war crimes committed during World War II, and led to the death of at least 5,000 Filipino soldiers and over 500 Americans in just over a week. Less than a month after the death march, The Japanese would have full control of the Philippines and surrounding countries by early May of 1942. This time period would signify the peak of Japanese expansion in the Pacific, as well as the strongest their overall army and navy would ever become. But this would be short lived, as the last thing on the Americans' minds was to surrender for good. Just 6 months earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor aimed to completely cripple the US Pacific Fleet and knock out virtually all of its naval power, and was seen as a huge success for them at the time. In reality, only two warships would be fully rendered useless: the USS Arizona and the USS Utah. The others were salvaged, and many would play key roles in securing victories at Midway and Guadalcanal in 1942, both of which were devastating blows to Japanese morale and would turn the tide of the war in an impressively short time frame. As MacArthur and his men pushed through the southwest to reach the Philippines, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his island hopping campaign would provide aid by cutting off Japanese supply lines to southern territories, giving them minimal resources to work with. Also, Nimitz would take airfields of the Marianas and Saipan by the summer of 1944, which gave his men a clear shot to begin bombing runs on Japanese strongholds in the Philippines, softening them up for an Allied invasion. On October 20th, 1944, MacArthur would step foot onto the Philippines almost 3 years after he swore he would return, keeping his promise. This day would mark the beginning of the Philippines campaign and would get them one step closer to liberating Manila, freeing its citizens, and reuniting with American prisoners of war after years of inhumane treatment. As the Japanese became aware that the US had landed in the Philippines and were advancing swiftly, they knew it was only a matter of time before Manila would also be invaded. Japanese command had ordered its men to withdraw from the city in anticipation of this invasion, pushing their soldiers into the northern mountains of the Philippines with plans to have a longer, drawn out fight with the Americans in order to prolong the time for them to prepare for an inevitable invasion of the home islands. They also knew that Manila was primarily comprised of wooden structures that could easily be destroyed by US bombardment and artillery, killing thousands of soldiers quickly if they dug in and set up strongholds. Overall, they thought it was a losing situation and had a better plan for victory. But the vice admiral in charge of the Japanese naval force in Manila rejected these orders to retreat, believing that it would make their country appear weak and that it went against the Japanese honor code to fight to the death, which is then exactly what he would train his men to do. He and his navy would refuse to evacuate the city and spent the entire month leading up to the battle preparing his men, turning the city into an unbreakable fortress. They would use the windows of buildings for hidden machine gun nests, booby trap houses or buildings, scatter landmines across the roads or streets of intersections, and utilize the underground pathways for safety, transportation, or defense. There were roughly 17,000 soldiers that would take part in defending Manila, but to call most of these men soldiers would be largely false. Although some had experience in ground combat, many would be aircraft engineers, aviation maintenance personnel, or Japanese civilians sent to work at the naval base with no experience in battle whatsoever, but ordered to hold their positions with whatever weapons they were given and take out as many Americans as they could, all the while knowing it would lead to certain death. The US troops from the 1st Cavalry Division would arrive on February 3rd, 1945. On this same day of the initial invasion, they would successfully liberate the city's university, which was being used as a Japanese internment camp since its occupation, saving thousands of American POWs along with many other Filipino prisoners as well. This was seen as a huge victory for the Allies, but the entire city was yet to be taken, and the brutal fight for the true victory had only just begun. The Americans brought in a sufficient number of tanks and artillery to start the advancement into the heart of the city where the Japanese would be eagerly waiting for them. The tanks were often used to fire directly at buildings and their openings or windows, blowing the Japanese strongholds within them to pieces. Artillery and explosive devices were not only used for this same purpose, but also for breaching weakened concrete walls or doors to allow troops to enter buildings from the ground up to face their enemy. Air support was used but was heavily limited to spare as many civilian lives as possible, as they would end up caught right in the middle of the battle, and in an attempt to ensure their safety, even the use of these tanks and shells became minimal. Troops would eventually have to begin making the trek through the city on foot. Moving through the open streets would be a certain death sentence for the Marines, as Japanese positions could fire upon them at any moment. They began moving more discreetly, building by building and floor by floor, with flamethrowers or grenades often being used to clear out rooms, cellars, or hidden tunnels beneath the city. The sewer system was utilized to move supplies and Japanese troops from one building to another to avoid detection, making for effective surprise attacks and assaults. The Americans would often meet their enemies head on using submachine guns, bayonets, or knives in terrifying engagements of close quarters combat. The Battle of Manila is often referred to as the Stalingrad of the Pacific Theater, with its lack of front lines, the brutal, unpredictable nature of urban combat, and the number of civilian lives involved and lost. By March 3rd, nearly all Japanese positions would be cleared out and Manila would be liberated. Once the battle had officially ended, 1,000 Americans would be killed and over 5,500 wounded. The Japanese would lose over 16,600 troops. Nearly all of their fighting force either died in combat or committed suicide, along with their admiral. The total number of civilian losses would easily be over 100,000. This was not only due to them being caught in the crossfire or being stuck in collapsing buildings, but many of them had fallen victim to the countless Japanese atrocities that took place during the battle. As far as the broader Philippine campaign, the work was not finished for the US by March, as the Japanese would actually hold out until the very end of the war, several areas north of the Philippines. But taking Manila was a huge victory with many valuable lessons learned, despite how costly it turned out to be. The city provided port access, receiving supplies to aid troops as they continued the fight in the north. Taking the city also allowed the Marines to help the Philippine prisoners gain back their government system and to liberate the internment camps, freeing and reuniting with thousands of American POWs. The battle not only exposed the brutal reality of urban fighting, but also what combat was like when a heavy number of civilians are involved, both of which gave the Americans an unsettling glimpse of how an invasion of mainland Japan would turn out. Although the American victory in the Battle of Manila helped MacArthur fulfill his promise, the unnecessary loss of innocent lives, deadly urban setting, and fanatical Japanese resistance had made it a painfully unforgettable recipe for disaster.